بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Welcome to the second session of Fiqh of Priorities. For those of you who heard last time, we went through, or if you weren't, we went through a small introduction as to what the topic is, and we talked about some of the historic foundations for the concept itself, because many times when you introduce a topic that people are not familiar with, they will react in a way that is negative just because they're not familiar with it, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have any precedence. And it's very similar to when someone asks me, they come to me to ask me, have you heard such and such hadith? And my specialization is not in hadith in the first place. And even if it was, it doesn't. So if they ask, have you heard this hadith? I say, no. And they say, oh, okay. And they assume it's not a hadith. I tell them, just because I haven't heard it doesn't mean it's not a hadith. I've heard maybe, a very small portion of the hadith that exists. So just because you haven't heard it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Similar to Friday prayer. We hold Friday prayer a little bit. The khutbah on Friday starts before Jummah a little bit. There's one sheikh, I just met him, he's visiting from Mecca. And he said he came 2 weeks ago, and he didn't realize there were 2 Jummahs. And so he came, and he didn't understand why we started so early. And then some brothers asked him, they got upset, and they asked him because they knew who he was, and so on. And once he realized the situation, he said, yeah, this actually, I'm Shafi'i, this is not allowed for us, but in the Hanbali school it's allowed. So it's not an issue. And the people kind of calmed down a little bit, but a lot of times people are not used to something, so they think there's no foundation for it. So we talked about some of the hadith and Quran that relate to the concept of priority and the concept of levels between actions. Talked about some historic examples in general, and then we talked about Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, and some of the things that he said about priorities, particularly the most important probably quote to remember from Imam al-Ghazali is "Tark tartib bin khairati min jumlat ash-shurur," that to leave the order between good deeds is a bad deed. That at any given time, we have a number of deeds that are competing with one another. And to leave the order between good deeds is itself a mistake. So this is something that's very important to remember. And then we went into Ibn Taymiyyah a little bit, rahimahullah, on the concept of the changing value of a deed based on changing conditions. So one of the examples we talked about was how, for a particular, generally, dhikr is better than dua, but for a particular person, their situation might dictate that for them, dua is better than dhikr. And that's an issue related to the heart. What's better for the person at that given time, depending on their conditions or on other things as well. We also talked about the concept of an imam, for example, doing something that they know is permissible, but not what they think is best, in order to teach the people and clarify to the people that it's permissible. So we talked about the different ways of praying with it, for example, or the whether or not you read Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud when you start Salah. These issues that are very well known in fiqh. So there's then so we talked about that. Second major area in Ibn Taymiyyah, some of the examples that he gives, one of them is 2 things you're supposed to do. So there's 2 things you're supposed to do. One of them is you're supposed to pay charity, and the other one is you're supposed to pay off your debt. Okay? So you're supposed to pay charity, and you're supposed to pay off your debt. Now, if you have extra money, which one do you choose? You pay your debt. You pay your debt. Many people in America are in debt, and yet they choose to give charity before they pay off their debt. Paying off the debt is a priority, especially if the debt is interest-based. If there's interest in this debt, you really need to pay it off, because not only is the priority to pay off the debt, but then on top of it, you have a debt that's in most cases haram, in the vast majority of cases haram. So this is definitely takes priority. So this is one of the examples also. Bad is tolerated in 2 situations. His conclusion is bad is tolerated in 2 situations: to repel a greater evil that cannot be repelled otherwise. So you have no choice but to do this thing. One of the examples that sometimes I bring up with people is is that, say someone, is it permissible for someone to smoke marijuana? Absolutely not, right? There's not really any question on this. Medical is different. We'll leave medical out for now. But in general, say someone, and medical like actual medical, not California medical, where everyone claims that they need medical marijuana and they're like going to stores all over the place. But that's it. We'll leave that one for now. But generally speaking, doing marijuana is not allowed, right? So, what if the person is a heroin addict, and the only way that they can limit their heroin usage is to smoke marijuana? What's the ruling then? Then you should probably smoke marijuana, right? This is a very interesting question. People get kind of shy with it, but it's a real situation. If you've ever met or dealt with someone who's addicted to heroin or any of these hard drugs, it's much more serious than marijuana, as an example. Actually, I met one brother, a good friend of mine. They had a brother that they know he was addicted to heroin, and it was really difficult. I mean, basically, the woman told him at the end of the day, if you want to help him, basically take him, put him in a car, and drive him to some place where he knows absolutely nobody, and lock him in the room for 4 days, 3 or 4 days, and don't let him out, no matter what he does or says, because it's the only way that you're going to break the withdrawals. I mean, it's very serious. So these are kind of some things we need to understand sometimes. And there's a lot of cases like that. Many things can happen on a daily basis where you're stuck between two things that are difficult, and you choose the one that's less bad, so to speak. Also, sometimes the good is left. So this is when the bad is tolerated. Sometimes something that's good is left. So, for example, good is left if it will result in a greater good. Okay, so it will result in a greater. It will lead to the loss of a greater good. So you have two options. Both of them are good, but you can only do one of them. So you don't do the one that's less good, which is the situation of paying the charity or paying debt. Right? Both of them are good in and of themselves, but they're competing now with each other. The second situation is that maybe it's something good, but it's going to cause more harm than the benefit that comes from it. So we talked about this in the context of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Send them about whoever sees evil, let them change it with their hand, and if not, then with their tongue, and if not, then they should hate it in their heart. This hadith is understood in light of that principle. So the concept here is that if you see an evil, to respond to that evil is a good thing. But if you're responding to that evil if the good that comes out of that is less than the harm that's going to be caused as a result of it, then it's not something. It's not the time to repel that evil. And this also has a lot of practical consequences, especially when you're dealing with people and you're trying to figure out when you should advise them. Maybe you just met somebody. For me, this happens a lot. This book is the thing that makes my life difficult, basically. And but it's actually the truth of the situation. Is how do you balance your priorities? So maybe I just met somebody, and there's something that they're doing that's wrong. But I know by my interactions with this person, if I tell them that what they're doing is wrong, I tell them that right now, number one, they're not going to accept it. Number two, they're never going to talk to me again. So what do? So you try to compartmentalize that wrong as long as it's not really hurting someone else. I mean, there's conditions to all of this, but in each situation is specific. But you try to, if possible, get to a point where you can tell the person, and then maybe they'll accept it. Or maybe just over time, they'll improve, they'll get better, and they'll start to fix these issues, inshallah. So that's Ibn Taymiyyah. He talks about that all in, I think it's all in his Fatawa. There's some other ulama also that talked about these things. Amongst them, we've already mentioned some of them. Al-Raghib bin Isfahani is a very famous scholar. He says, من شغله الفضل عن الفضل فهو معذور ومن شغله النفل عن الفضل فهو مغرور. that the one who busies themselves with their busyness with what's obligatory, stop them from what's doing optional, then that person is excused. Basically, they did what was right. They didn't do what was optional and good for them to do, but they were busy with what was more important, so that's okay. But then the second half of it is the one who busies themselves with the optional to the detriment of the required, then they're maghrur, then they've been deceived. They're not putting things in their right place. One of the common places you'll see this, I'll pick on young people for a second. One of the common places you'll see this with younger people is in professional advancement and in school. So someone will get very involved in Islam, they get excited about Islam, which is extremely important. And that preserving that kind of high spirit in relation to practicing the faith is an objective in and of itself. So we don't want to break that, but at the same time, you kind of have to temper it a little bit to get them to understand that, yes, we want you to be involved, yes, we want you to help organize, yes, we want you to attend classes, yes, we want you to watch endless YouTube videos. I personally don't, but some people like to watch endless YouTube videos of just random benefit. But all of that comes second below some other things. Like if you're in school, you need to do well in school. And if you need to work, then you need to work. That takes a priority. If you need to take care of your family, then you need to take care of your family. These are like high, top priorities. And the other things that come after them, they come with the extra time that you have to do them accordingly. So that finishes the section on Fiqh of Priorities and history. So let's go to a very important topic then, which is Fiqh of Priorities and knowledge and thought. So what are the priorities in knowledge and thought? Part number one is priority of knowledge before action. Priority of knowledge before action. One of the phenomena that we see now, particularly in Southern California, this is kind of like, in my experience, this is a very Southern California trend, which is people want to be very involved in Islam, and they want to help Islam as much as they can, and they want to be active and so on and so forth, but they don't actually want to know what Islam says. So they want to be involved and serve Islam how they want to serve Islam, what they perceive to be the correct thing, what they think is acceptable, what they completely understand from their own minds is how they want to do it. But there's not really an emphasis on understanding actually what does the Quran say, what does the Sunnah say, how the scholars of Islam interpreted these two sources. Those things are usually thrown out the window. People just want to do whatever they want. And this is a huge mistake. Because there's the priority of knowledge before action. And that's why Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu, he said, الْعِلْمُ إِمَامٌ وَالْعَمَلُ تَابِعُهُ. That knowledge is the imam, and action follows the imam. You know, when you're in salah, you follow the imam, right? This is a reminder to everyone. We shouldn't be going before the imam. Some people get very excited, and they end up in front of the imam. We should be very wary of this, because it can break one's salah. So we follow the imam. Same thing in action. The imam of action is knowledge. If you don't know, and this is not only shari'i knowledge. Shari'i knowledge, you know, halal, haram, all of these things is one side of it. But also not understanding the situation. You know, both of them should be there. It's not just that someone knows the halal and haram and they think like they're the right person to, I don't know, be the top engineer in the department or whatever. I have no engineering knowledge. It's not my business. So if I don't know about that, I'm not someone who should be working in it. Likewise, you know, people, for example, people who want to volunteer in a masjid, especially if one does so regularly. Someone holds a regular position in a masjid and volunteering, someone's on a board, something like this, they should take seeking knowledge very seriously. Because now you're in a position of leadership and setting vision for an entire community. If you're ignorant, it's a huge problem. So these things are all related. Bukhari, rahimahullah, in his book of the Sahih, and as I mentioned before, the chapter titles in Sahih al-Bukhari are lessons in and of themselves. So one of the things that people don't usually know about Imam al-Bukhari is that he was also a great scholar in fiqh. And so when he lays out his book, the way he titles chapters, there's also lessons in them. And sometimes he'll even put a hadith as the chapter title, because he thinks the hadith is good enough for you to take the lesson from it, but it's not strong enough that he includes it in his actual collection. So what he'll do is he'll put it in the chapter title. So it's in there, and you learn from it, but it's not considered actually part of Sahih al-Bukhari. It's not part of the actual collection of hadith. So there's a lot of things to learn from that. And so he has one of his chapter titles is An Ilm al-Qawli wal-Amal, the chapter on knowledge before action and speech. Someone should know what they're saying and doing before they do it or say it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لِذَنْبِكَ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ. Know that He is Allah, there is no God except Him, and then ask for forgiveness for the believing men and women. So the action is, sometimes we also limit action. Making istighfar is action, making dhikr is action, praying is action, making dua for someone is action, going and visiting someone when they're sick is action, organizing an event for workers' justice or whatever it is action. There's many different layers of action. So the verse is saying, say that He is La ilaha illallah, then say there's no God but Allah, then seek forgiveness. So the idea is that first the knowledge is there. Knowledge is that Allah is one. The consequence of the knowledge that Allah is one is you ask Allah for forgiveness. And the Prophet ﷺ, a very famous hadith is that the one that Allah wants good for them, they will give them understanding of the faith. Give them understanding of the faith, because that's the source of everything. So, number two then is the knowledge is number 2 point is, so number one is knowledge before action. Number two is knowledge is a priority for any leadership position. Knowledge is a priority for any leadership position. And you guys, some of you know my qualm with the concept of leadership in the first place. I'm not really a big proponent of leadership theories and stuff like that, as they're commonly known. I think there's branches of it that would agree with what I'm saying. Basically, I believe in the leadership model of community surveys. So, basically, whoever is the best in serving the people is the leader, and everything else is secondary. How eloquent they are, all of these other things are really secondary issues. What's primary is, does this person know what they're talking about, and are they in the service of the Muslims? They're in the service of the Muslims, and they're a leader. That's all there is to it. But knowledge does come up across different boards, and there are things that help in this, and we're going to come to some of them. So we'll give a couple examples from the Quran, at least 4 or 5. The first is political administration. So the one level of leadership is political administration. Someone's in charge of people. And the example of this in the Quran is Yusuf alayhi salam. So what does Yusuf alayhi salam say? It said when he gets put in a position of, comes out of prison, and so he says, قَالَ جَعَلْنِي عَلَى خَزَائِنَ الْأَرْضِ إِنِّي حَفِيظٌ عَلِيمٌ. So this is, how does he describe himself? He says, put me in a position of responsibility over the treasuries of the land. That's what he tells the man after he's released from prison. So put me in a position of leadership over the treasuries of the land. And then he says, إِنِّي حَفِيظٌ عَلِيمٌ. I am trustworthy, I'm reliable, I'm trustworthy, and I'm knowledgeable. So he said, what are the two responsibilities for being in this position of economic leadership, particularly dealing with the money of the land and the people? He's reliable, he's trustworthy, and he's knowledgeable. So he mentions knowledge as one of the characteristics. Number 2 is military leadership. So for military leadership, we have the story of Talut, Saul. Actually, I wanted to name our son Talut. I've never heard this name before. It doesn't sound very nice, but I think it's such a cool story from the Quran. But it didn't pass. Ismail is a good name. So Saul, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about Saul? He says, قَالَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ اصْطَفَاهُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَزَادَهُ بَسْطَةً فِي الْعِلْمِ وَالْجِسْمِ. That He has chosen Saul to be your leader, وَزَادَهُ بَسْطَةً فِي الْعِلْمِ وَالْجِسْمِ. And he increased him and he gave him sustenance in knowledge and in physical stature. So the first one, economic leadership, the person is reliable, they're trustworthy, and they're knowledgeable. The second one, military leadership, they're physically capable, and they're knowledgeable. So also, knowledge comes in again. The third is judicial leadership. So the Prophet ﷺ said there are three types of qadis, three types of people that give a judgment. اثنان في النار وواحد في الجنة. Two of them are in hellfire, and one of them is in paradise. Two of them are in hellfire, and one of them is in paradise. The first one is the person who knows the truth and judges by it. That person is in paradise. Person who knows the truth and they judge by it is in paradise. The second person is the person who is not knowledgeable and they still rule. They still pass judgments. They don't know what they're talking about, but they still pass judgments. That person is in hell. That person is in the nar. The third person is the person who knows the truth and rules in opposition to the truth. They give the ruling in opposition to it. You can imagine all three scenarios happening, right? The third possibility is there. And that one is also going to be punished by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is, what is the issue that comes up again? In the judging, the judicial, is the person knowledgeable or not? Then the second half of it is, are they able to act upon their knowledge? The fourth one is knowledge as necessary for the mufti. So qadi is a little bit different than the mufti. Qadi's ruling is binding, essentially. And the mufti's ruling is not binding. There's nothing to force the ruling of the mufti. But the qadi, their ruling is forced because the weight of the law is behind it. So they're a little bit different. One of the stories in this regard is the story in the time of the Prophet ﷺ when some companions, they were outside of Medina, and a man who had an injury in his head, and he asked them, he needed to make a ghusl. He was in a state of janaba, he needed to make a ghusl, and so he asked the people what he should do. And they told him, you should just wash yourself, like you normally would. Even though he has this wound on his head that's open, it's very bad. They told him, you just wash yourself, you put water over it, everything. He ended up actually dying from this. So it's very serious, right? So they came back to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, قَتَلُوهُ قَتَلَهُمُ اللَّهُ. He said, they killed him, may God's curse be upon them. Qatala, when it's used in dua, is not necessarily that may they be killed. It's usually means may they lie. Usually means la'anahum Allah. So just as a side point. So the Prophet ﷺ said this. It's very serious. And he said, أَلَا سَأَلُوا إِذَا لَمْ يَعْلَمُوا. Why would they not ask if they did not know? If they didn't know, they should have asked. فَإِنَّمَا شِفَاء الْعَيِّ السُّؤَالِ إِنَّمَا كَانَ يَكْفِيهِ أَنْ يَتَيَمَّمَ. That the only way to cure this lack of knowledge is to ask. And all he needed to do was make tayammum. Didn't need to make rules. So this is very serious, actually. And a lot of people, subhanAllah, I don't know, it makes me, sometimes I sit at home and I think about this issue and it makes me crazy. I don't understand how people are so lax in saying whatever they feel like about their deen. I don't understand it. Where did you come up with the concept that you can just say whatever you want about Allah and His Messenger? And it goes on both sides. It goes on sides of people that are less religious, they just want to do whatever they want. And it goes on sides of people that are more religious. And they think that just because they grew up with something or they heard something said here and there that they know. You don't know. Unless you've actually sat and looked it up and done extensive research, you do not know. And this is, subhanAllah, something that I always told people is that when you study in the College of Sharia, you come out looking like a fool. So I studied in the College of Sharia. When you study in the College of Sharia, you come out looking like a fool. Because the only thing you study is fiqh and usul fiqh. And most of what you deal with on the ground is not fiqh and usul of fiqh. Usually what people want to know about is like issues related to the heart, nice stories, some Islamic history, stuff to make them feel good, which is totally understandable. But you didn't study it. I didn't study that stuff. 6 years, I didn't touch that stuff. So you come back and you don't know that, which is what most people want. Then, on the side of the questions that people actually ask, on a day-to-day basis, is this allowed, is this not allowed, what do I do, my husband said this to me, am I actually divorced, am I not divorced, what's the situation, all of this stuff that comes up. You know enough to not answer right away. Right? You know enough to not answer right away, so you just look foolish. Whereas someone else, they learn not enough, so they think that they know the answer. Right? So they'll answer right away. You think like, SubhanAllah, how did you answer so quickly? This is someone's life. You don't just answer so quickly. And so there's a lot of details in these things that sometimes gets overlooked. So it's very important. This point is extremely important. We don't want to be people who talk about the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without knowing what we're saying. This is the way of Allah. It's not something like. And that's why Ibn Sirin, rahimahullah, was one of the scholars of the Tabi'een, one of the scholars of the generation after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, لأن يموت الرجل جاهلا خير له من أن يقول ما لا يعلم. Said it's better for a person to die ignorant than for them to say that which they do not know. It's better for them to die ignorant than for them to say that which they do not know. Abu Hussein al-Ash'ari, he was also one of the early scholars. He said, إن أحدكم لا يفتي في المسألة ولو وردت على عمر لجمع لها أهل بدر. He says, one of you will be asked a question and you'll give fatwa on it. And if that same question was asked to Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he would have brought all of the people at Badr together and asked them the question. He says, think about it. This is what Umar used to do. If Umar was asked something and it was a tough question, he would bring all of the people at Badr together and he would ask them, what is your opinion on this, before he gives a ruling. So he says, one of you will be asked a question, you'll answer it. But if Umar was asked this question, then he would have brought all of the people at Badr together. The last category is necessity of knowledge for the da'iyah and teacher. So we talked about all of these positions of leadership, but also for the person who's just calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in general. You don't have to be so knowledgeable. But an important point, you don't have to be extremely knowledgeable to remind people about Allah. But you need to know what you do know. So, sometimes you say this to people and they'll be like, well, why are you putting all these barriers up? Why can't we just tell people about Allah and so on and so forth? Coming from the perspective of a convert, because when you don't know what you're talking about, you put people through a lot of hardship. And it's not only knowing what you say, but when to say certain things and when not to say other things. If someone has just become a Muslim, you don't need to talk to them about all the detailed differences of opinion and stuff and prayer and how to do it and all of these things. Just tell them how to pray in the easiest way you possibly can. We have books in the office, the best books ever written I've seen so far on how to teach a convert how to pray, written by Imam Mustafa Umar, hafidhahullah. And I wished I had it when I became a Muslim. And just the thing here is then they'll quote the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, convey that which you know from me, even if it's one verse. So I said, why are you making it so difficult? Right? So this is the answer. So sometimes we need to, it's good sometimes, people don't usually like to nitpick, but it's actually good sometimes to nitpick because it makes your brain sharper. Okay? So when the Prophet ﷺ says, بَلِّغُوا عَنِّي وَلَوْ آيَةً, convey from me even if it's one verse. He's commanding his companions to convey from him. So what does that mean? That means they understood the verse. That's what's important. They understood the verse, and they understood how to apply the verse, and they understood the way that the Prophet ﷺ lives. So they're able to put the verse in context. It's not just they grab some hadith from somewhere and they start giving it to everyone, or they grab some verse from somewhere and they start giving it to everyone without really understanding it. These are two different issues. If you're conveying, he says, convey from me to his companions. So they're learning it directly from the source. Once you, and so this is very important. And again, one of the most important things for the person who's calling towards Allah or teaching about Islam in kind of like an informal sense is the issue of tadarruj. It's gradualism. Gradualism. Take things step by step. You have to like jump into the huge things. Make sure people are solid, that they believe in Allah, that they have a relationship with Allah, that they make dua, that they pray on time, that they read the Quran, that they have some sort of emphasis on their own spiritual development before they're worried about fixing everything else. You know, make sure the foundations are there. The foundations are there, they can add slowly, step by step. And this is also part of the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Trying to figure out which other things to put emphasis on. So the next one is priority of understanding over rote memorization. And there's a caveat here because there is merit to memorization. Which I spoke at Irvine High this morning and I told them there's merit to memorization, even if the Western educational model tells you otherwise. But there is merit to memorization. Once you've memorized something, you have it. It's not going anywhere. You can always refer to it. You can reference it. You can bring it to bear on your issues. It's much different than when you don't have something. But that means that you memorized it while understanding it. Right? So if you memorized it and you understand it, then you can use it. But if you memorize it without understanding it, maybe that's a good thing if you're younger and you plan on understanding it later, and you want to take advantage of youth where it's easy to memorize, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. But the point is, in the end, the priority is to understand. The priority is to understand. And that's why some people, a lot of people, it's very interesting. I'll give you one issue that comes up. Generally in our communities, especially certain subsets of the communities, the be-all, end-all of Islamic learning is to memorize the Quran. Okay? So, someone memorizes the Quran, that's it. And the truth of the matter is that that's a really, really, really good meritorious thing, and it's something that should be done. But it's not the be-all, end-all in any way. Even when you read traditional discourses on who's a mujtahid and who's not, the conditions for someone who can make ijtihad, they can bear their own opinion, they can read the Quran and the Sunnah and give their own opinion on the Quran and the Sunnah. Many scholars said memorizing the Quran is not a condition. So, why did that become like the end-all in the whole discussion? And then people will get upset with me because I didn't memorize a whole lot of Quran and stuff like that. And I happen to have forgotten large portions of stuff that I memorized because busyness of work and life. But it wasn't a priority for me. I'll tell you straight up, it wasn't a priority for me. I went to Egypt and my main priorities were to learn the Arabic language so that I can access all of the body of Muslim scholarship. And my second priority was to try to come to some level of mastery of al-wasa'id. In knowledge there's wasa'id and there's so basically the wasa'il are the means. The goal was to come to a deep understanding of the means. So hadith sciences, Quran sciences, usul fiqh, and Arabic language. And if you understand those things, then you can analyze the sources. You can memorize them whenever you want. That's something that's going to take time. But that experience in itself was something that I could not get here. Here, Shaykh Muhammad is here, Shaykh Ibrahim is here, you can memorize the Quran. But I couldn't get that. I couldn't get the deep analysis of those sources there. So the priority for me, I consider to be that. So this is for a question. Yeah, so the condition that's put, one of the conditions, is that the person who's going to make ijtihad they have to have a full and complete understanding of all of the verses that have to do with rulings. So they have to do an in-depth study of the verse that has to do with the ruling. What are the different opinions? How did they come to those conclusions? How do you analyze the verse? So you do a really deep study of it. But do you have to memorize it? Many scholars say technically no, you don't. Should you memorize it? Yes, you should. Right? If you're going to spend so many years of study, it's a good thing to memorize it because it's good for your heart to memorize the Quran and have it with you and stuff. But I'm just trying to make a point that understanding is actually more important than the other issues. Memorization, which is not to say, please nobody misunderstand me, which is not to say that you shouldn't memorize. There's merit to memorizing. And I think everyone should memorize certain things. We should know, we should at least be familiar enough with certain things that we have some foundation that we can rely on. Skip those ones. Okay. So we'll cover now some priorities in reform. So what are priorities in reform? Most of what we try to do on a daily basis or with people is we're trying to do some active reform, trying to improve things at some level. So priority number one is quality over quantity. Quality over quantity. And this is not to say that we shouldn't care whether or not people come or go. Should, but we should keep in mind that the priority is quality. If you have 1,000 people and they're useless, it doesn't really mean anything. If you have 20 people and they're useful, it makes a huge difference. And this is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that, he said that there will come a time when all of the nations will eat you. Eat from, attack the Muslims and everything else, the way that animals attack a dish of food. And they said, is it because we're going to be few in number? And he said, no. Actually, your numbers will be vast. Your numbers will be like the foam on the ocean. Tons, there will be plenty of Muslims. But you'll be weak because that you will love because of your love for this world and your hatred of death. That the Muslims will get to a point where all they care about is the beauty of this world, and they're scared to die. And so the numbers will be vast, but the numbers will serve no consequence. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَلْ أَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنْ عِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ وَلَقَدْ نَصَرَكُمُ اللَّهُ بِبَدْرٍ وَأَنْتُمْ أَذِلَّةٌ. And then in the Battle of Hunayn, إِذْ أَعْجَبَتْكُمْ كَثْرَتُكُمْ. So in these verses, it's Allah saying, for example, the first one, rather, most of them do not understand. Most of them do not understand. So that means who understands? A few of them. The quality over the quantity. The second one, he says, وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنْ عِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ. And few of my servants are thankful. Only a few of them that have that quality. In the Battle of Badr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and when He gave you victory, when Allah gave you victory in Badr, and you were weak, you were small in number and weak on that day, but Allah gave you victory because the quality was there. In Hunayn, the Battle of Hunayn, the Muslims came out to the Battle of Hunayn, and they said, MashaAllah, before we didn't have numbers, and we still won, and now we have numbers. So Allah is rebuking them. When you were joyous about your numbers were so much and you thought that was going to give you victory. That's not what's going to give you victory. And then the hadith that I just mentioned. Another example of this is Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, quality over quantity, in that one time, and it's kind of cool sometimes to see these narrations about how the companions were with each other. They were sitting around and they saw Ibn Mas'ud climbing a palm tree, and they saw him, and then when he climbed the palm tree, his legs became exposed, and they were very, very skinny. So when the other companions saw his skinny legs, they started to point and laugh. They started to make fun of him that his legs are skinny and so on and so forth, look at him and whatever. And the Prophet ﷺ stopped them and he told them that his legs are heavier in the scale on the Day of Judgment than the mountain of Uhud. So his legs are heavier than the mountain of Uhud. Because the quality of Ibn Mas'ud is such that even if physically he's weak, spiritually he's very strong. He's very, very powerful, very brave. Which we see later on that he volunteered to be the one who reads the Quran in front of Quraysh, even though he's very weak, clan-wise, his tribal connections and everything is very weak. And he volunteered to be the one who does it. And they told him, we don't want you to do it because you don't have any support. They're going to attack you, no one's going to help you. And he said, I want to do it anyways. So he did it, and he went out in front of the Kaaba and he started to recite Surah Al-Rahman. And he was attacked. And they told him afterwards, this is what we were afraid of, that this was going to happen to you. And he said, well, I will do it again, no heartbeat, it doesn't bother me. So Ibn Mas'ud was very, very strong, even though he was physically not as powerful, so to speak. This also brings up in the priority of quality over quantity, the importance of ihsan. That the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah has written ihsan in all things, excellence. The quality is what matters. If you do a lot of things and all of them are poor quality, nobody's impressed, nobody's inspired, nobody feels good. But if you do a few things and you do them well, then that is more impressive and more lasting. Also, you see different effects of the consequence of quality. The Prophet ﷺ, his entire messengership was 23 years. But the consequence of his messengership is the greatest consequence in human history. It's only from 23 years. Political systems established, economic systems established, social systems established, markets are established, how to deal with human beings, individual, social, family, everything is covered in 23 years. Actually, really, a lot of that stuff was covered in the last 10 years. But the quality is so high that world history is affected by it. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was only the ruler of the Muslims for 2.5 years. But what he was able to do in that time was incredible. Same thing with Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, 2.5 years. But he did a lot. Imam al-Shafi'i died at the age of 54. He's relatively young, but still we talk about him today and we study him today and we know his opinions and so on. Imam al-Nawawi, who everyone has to study if they want to know something about Islam, you have to deal with his works at some level, died at the age of 45. Died at the age of 45. He died at the age of 45 having one of the most famous commentaries on Sahih Muslim. Having the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi that he put together himself, that everyone still studies up to today. Having compiled Riyadh al-Salihin, which is a book, it's unique in its character, and people still study it up to today. Having written a text, a primer in Shafi'i Fiqh, which is introductory. It's a very, usually beginning students will study it. Also having written al-Majmu', which is like the end-all in fiqh. It's like 30 volumes. A commentary on every single issue with all of the madahib and all of the opinions and why they said it and weighing them and everything. Massive work. Having written introduction to the manners that are necessary in dealing with the Quran. Having written books in tazkiyah and spiritual development. I mean, he literally wrote in everything. And he died at the age of 45. So quality is really what matters rather than quantity. Another major principle here in the Fiqh of Priorities and Reform is changing people before changing institutions. You change people before you change institutions. So basically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. That Allah will not change the condition of the people until they change that which is within themselves. Change what's in yourself and you find then a change in the community. Change what's in the people and you'll find a change in the institution. But don't think that you're just going to build a building. I won't name names, but I recall a certain youth center that was one time opened. And some people who were behind opening it, they got upset afterwards. They said, we built this youth center and there's no youth. So, well, you should have thought about that before you built the center. I mean, and this is one of the things that I don't understand. We build buildings, but we don't have anyone to lead communities in the building. What do you think the building is going to do? Coming together and praying is wonderful, alhamdulillah. You can come together and pray anywhere. This is really like the Prophet ﷺ, yes, established masjid very early on. But who was it that ran the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ? The Prophet. right? If you don't have someone to lead and to teach and to do all of these things, you don't build a youth center without thinking about who's going to run the youth center. This is madness, actually. If you think about it, think about young people for a few minutes. Think about what's going to happen if you open a space for young people without anyone there to supervise and lead them. What's going to happen? It's going to turn into a mess within like 3 days. 3 days later, you're going to go there and be like, what is going on here? This is chaos, right? So this is a very, very big priority. People definitely always take priority over institutions. So you start with the individual, then you move to the family, then you move to the society. People before buildings. People before buildings. Okay. Okay, we can finish this last section, inshallah, and then, well, maybe we can. We'll see how far we get, so that next time we can finish with priorities and commands and prohibitions, which is very interesting. So we move then to priorities and work and action. Number one is you give priority to actions that are consistent. Give priority to actions that are consistent. So the Prophet ﷺ said, أحب الأعمال إلى الله أدومها وإن قل. That the most beloved of actions to Allah are those that are consistent, even if they are few. Most beloved actions to Allah are those that are consistent, even if they are few. So it's better to do a few things regularly than to do a bunch of things and then burn out. It's better to be consistent. This has lasting effects on yourself, has lasting effects on the people that are around you. Also, Aisha radiallahu anha was asked, أَيُّ الْعَمَلِ كَانَ أَحَبَّ إِلَى النَّبِي صلى الله عليه وسلم. She was asked, what was the most beloved of action to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم? She said, the consistent one, the one that continues. She said, he also said, in one situation, he was came across someone who was doing too much worship. And he said, عليكم بما تطيقون فوالله ما يغن الله حتى تمنوا. That basically that's wrong, and you should do that which you are able to do, what's within your capability, because Allah does not become bored until you become bored. So basically, like, as long as you are doing the deed well, then Allah will continue to be pleased with that deed. But as soon as the deed just becomes like something you just do, you're doing so much of it that it becomes like you're not really focused at all on it, then that's a problem. There's another tradition where Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, basically, the paraphrasing is the household of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if they did an action, that when they did something, they established it. It's really like a nice expression that she uses. When they did something, they established it. It was set. They start praying in the night, they pray in the night. It's not going anywhere. It's set. So this is very important. Priority of actions that are consistent. Priority number two is things that have extended benefit over limited benefit. So what does this mean? I'll explain. So one of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is فَضْلُ الْعِلْمِ أَحَبُّ إِلَيَّ مِنْ فَضْلِ الْعِبَادَةِ وَخَيْرُ دِينِكُمْ الْوَرَعُ. Said that the benefit or the excess in knowledge is more beloved to me than the excess or benefit in worship. And there's other things like this as well. There's traditions that basically state that the merit of the scholar is much, much higher than the merit of the worshipper. So someone said, why? What? No, what's the thing here? The thing here is that the benefit of the worshipper is limited. The benefit of the scholar is extended. The worshipper benefits themselves. Right? They do worship, The direct benefit is themselves. They're the one who benefits from their worship. But yeah, it affects the lives of people around them, but essentially it's a personal act. But the person who learns and teaches, that's an act that actually extends to others, so there's more benefit in that. And this is basically the main example here. Also, one of the people who's referred to, praised in many different hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is Imam Adil. Allahumma wali umurna khiyarana wa la tuwali umurna shirarana. That the Prophet ﷺ praised in many hadith, the leader, the ruler of the Muslims who's just. Because if the ruler is just, it affects large quantities of things. If the ruler is unjust, it affects large quantities of things. So that one person or that group of people can be very influential. Another thing is to prefer long-term benefit over short-term. So one of the things here would be sadaqah jariyah. That you think about, if you have an option, what can I give that will have lasting benefit? If I teach someone something, if I give a charity that remains, if you have a child that is righteous, all of these things, are examples of lasting acts of worship. Another thing here is important, maybe this is a good stopping point, is the priority of the work of the heart over the work of the limbs. The priority of the work of the heart over the work of the limbs. Again, this needs some nuancing. This does not mean that anyone should ever leave the obligations of the limbs because they don't feel their heart in it, for example. So someone will say, I keep praying, but I don't actually feel my prayer. I'm not feeling my prayer, what should I do? And, it's actually a huge trick of the shaitan to stop praying. Your job then is not to stop praying. Your job is to keep praying and asking Allah to soften your heart and make good come from it and so on. This is part of the process that you continue to do it. The obligation of the limbs does not stop because the heart is not there, but the priority should be on the heart. Focus on the heart. And know that if you do what Allah has obligated out of devotion to Allah, even if you don't feel it, you will eventually feel it. Because that's actually also an act of the heart. The Prophet ﷺ, as we know, said that actions are by their intentions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept any action that is not pure for His sake. And this is something that's extremely primary. One of the things, and sometimes, we think that we're sincere about something, but we don't realize that we're insincere. I'll give you a very, very practical example. And one of the very tricky areas that I consider it's a very touchy red line for me, just as a notice to put it out there for people. So someone, for example, may believe that they're giving charity with sincerity, that they're sincerely giving this charity for the sake of Allah. But then what they'll do is they expect special treatment because of their charity. So they think that their opinion means more because they were able to donate more. Or that they should have a say in what happens just because they donate, regardless of whether or not they know what they're talking about or anything else. Or that they want to control things a little bit because, they bring in this donor or that donor or whatever it is. And this has absolutely no foundation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually very severe with this. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تُبْطِلُوا صَدَقَاتِكُمْ بِالْمَنِّ وَالْأَذَى. O you who believe, do not cause your charities to go in vain by reminding people of them and causing harm because of them. It's very clear. Quran is very clear on this issue. That if you give for the sake of Allah, you give for the sake of Allah. You don't give for the sake of power or controlling things or whatever. And people do this across the board. It's very famous. And it becomes habitual for some people. They don't think about it anymore. So you want to hold influence with a police department or a politician or whatever it is. This is basically how lobbying works, right? You want to have influence over the politician, you spend money on them, and then you control them. It's completely messed up, actually, in Islam. Even judges in Islam, the judge is not permitted to accept a gift. If the gift is considered to be in any way or form something that's abnormal, they're not permitted to accept the gift. It becomes haram for them. Because what if it could be like some sort of subtle bribing, you know? And so this is a very tricky issue, but the point is that sometimes we can think we're sincere, and with time there will be like little things that creep out. Sometimes we think we're sincere, sometimes we actually are sincere, but then later on we want someone to praise us for what we did. So for example, it's not from the etiquette or teachings or culture of Islam for a person to talk about the good that they do. If you need to mention something in particular to make a point, that's possibly an exception, but still gets a little bit tricky. But we shouldn't be telling people, you know. Like, there's no need. Say you go in the street and you help someone, and like you find that they're hungry and you feed them or whatever it might be. There's no reason for you to come and like, Assalamu alaikum, how are you? How are you? Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. How's your family? Family's good. You know, today I found a horse and I fed them. Alhamdulillah, I'm really glad that you just lost the reward for what you did. I mean, I don't understand like what the need. These things are very subtle. We think that we're doing it out of sincerity, but then in the end, you know, something will slip, and we realize that actually, no, now it wasn't purely for the sake of Allah, so that people can look at me this way or that way, or that I can get some recognition for it, someone will respect me a little bit more. And so these things are very, very important and very touchy. But the focus should always be on the heart. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْظُرُ إِلَىٰ أَجْسَادِكُمْ وَلَا إِلَىٰ صُورِكُمْ وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَىٰ قُلُوبِكُمْ. That Allah does not look at your forms and your bodies, but rather He looks at your hearts. Doesn't matter, you can make it look as nice as you want. Make it look as nice as you want. But if what's inside behind it is bad, it's bad. There's no getting around it. And so this is a major issue. One of the major foundational priorities then related to the heart, two of them are to love Allah and His Messenger more than anything else. To love Allah and His Messenger more than anything else. And to love for others what you love for yourself. These are primary issues of the heart. Primary issues of the heart. To love Allah and His Messenger more than anything else. And to love for others what you love for yourself. Very simple things, but actually very powerful and deep things that have to be ingrained in the heart over time. And so we should always be aware that we're not putting emphasis on the external without realizing that it should come to the inside, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to act upon that which we know and to be sincere in all of our affairs. And we ask Him in His mercy and His bounty to forgive us for our shortcomings, because verily we have many of them, and to accept from us our deeds. We ask Him also to have mercy on the mother of our brother, Harun, who passed away earlier this week. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on her, elevate her, and make her stay in the grave easy for her. And we ask also for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy on the aunt of our brother Abdullah, who passed away last week, and to make things easy for her to enter into paradise, inshallah. Ameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi.